So, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the glyphosate executive order and Massie's uh, proposed law to counter it. I'm going to butcher glyphosate several times, or I might make it through. It's one of those weird words. I've been mispronouncing it my whole life, so it's really hard for me to say it right. But since it's spelled out properly, I might get it. So there's much ado about what's going on with elemental phosphorus and glyphosate in the executive order. Massie has passed, or not passed, but has proposed an anti-glyphosate bill. And one of the things that came up is in the shadow of all this, RFK noted that glyphosate and pesticides are part of the way we do things, and essentially kind of accepting the status quo that, but something that eventually must be revamped. And people are basically freaking out. They're basically saying it's like some incredible betrayal of MAHA and all these other things. So the issues, as I see them, is first the EO doesn't seem to provide the immunity that Massie is suggesting it does, and we'll talk about that. Another major issue is moving away from glyphosate, synthetic fertilizer, and GMO plants is something that can't be done overnight. In all likelihood, it's something that it needs to be a generational issue, something that might take place over decades. So let's talk a little bit about the EO specifics. Essentially, what it's dealing with is elemental phosphorus. Uh, and elemental phosphorus has one producer in the United States, and it just so happens it is Bayer, the same company that makes aspirin and Roundup, which is primary component is glyphosate. However, and just so it differentiate between general phosphorus production and elemental phosphorus. Elemental phosphorus is a refined phosphorus that has more utility than the stuff that's been mined and gone through its initial processing. Elemental phosphorus is used in munitions, many different types, including white phosphorus, uh, smoke grenades, smoke munitions, smoke generating devices, which are critical in the military. It's also used in computer chip production. It's used in radar applications. It's used in stealth technology. And it's a key ingredient in glyphosate, Roundup. What the EO does is it gives the Department of War and Agriculture the ability to prioritize production of elemental phosphorus as a matter of national defense. And this falls under some defense act that was, I believe, was passed either right before or right after World War II. Essentially, what it does is preventing offshoring of capacity. So, if for some reason elemental phosphorus became too expensive to produce here and Bayer wanted to produce it elsewhere, this actually prevents them from doing it. Essentially, it can compel domestic production when needed. This could theoretically increase stability of the market, which could induce production increases, possibly bringing in other producers. It specifically limits liability in the production and distribution of phosphorus and glyphosate. This liability precludes other customers being sued due to being put last in line. So, in other words, let's say uh, the United States government says we need elemental phosphorus for defense purposes. So, therefore, we are now suddenly first in line. This would block or basically put other orders to the rear. This prevents these customers from suing the manufacturer based on delays or other things like that. So if the other customers who are put down line because of these defense requests uh, have some kind of damages occur to them where they're like, hey, we lost business or whatever, they can't sue. At least they can't sue the company. They could potentially ask the government for assistance, but they can't sue the company based on this EO. Not, and be clear, it isn't the EO that's preventing these kind of lawsuits. It's the original defense law in the first place. Another thing to understand about these immunities, they're not retroactive. So if there are lawsuits in place currently or in any form of the process that deal with elemental phosphorus anyway, including glyphosate, it does not immunize them. It also does not immunize against negligence. And here's the part where I'm a little unclear on because I've read it a bunch of different ways. And my understanding is it does not immunize against end use. So therefore, where Massie is claiming, and he may be right, but I'm not reading it the way he's reading it. Uh, my understanding is that the producer can't be sued when they're making the chemical on behalf of the federal government, but it doesn't immunize against use. So if, for instance, they determine that the end use is causing problems, it does not necessarily immunize the manufacturer from lawsuits. Another thing is the law that Massey is attempting to pass prohibits money from being allocated for this. Okay, so there is no money allocated for this because the EO doesn't have any control of money. Now, there's potential there could be some money floating around within the executive branch that theoretically could be put in this direction. The House resolution would prevent this, but there is no money actually allocated for it. So it's another one of those things where it's a little bit shadowy. So the law and precedence does not give liability immunity to end use. So I'm thinking what Massie may be doing is he may be trying to anticipate some new precedents coming from a court trial, i.e., let's say there's an end use lawsuit where a user uses it and says, "Hey, I'm suing," and Bear steps in with their lawyers and says, "Hey, because of this EO and because we're under defense directives, we want the court to give us remedy and protect us." And Massie may be trying to prevent precedent from being set. I've not heard this anywhere, but it's the only thing that makes sense to me. So I don't know if I'm not saying it is. I'm just saying that's the only thing I can come up with. So first, I want to talk a little bit about my agricultural bona fides before getting into some of the stuff about agriculture. So I'm not talking entirely off the top of my head. I have been a small cow herd owner for over a decade now. My whole methodology in cow grazing is using regenerative agriculture as the thing that we'd like to get to. In addition to running small cow herds, I've also run fairly sizable chicken flocks, sometimes in the thousands. And when I was, the primary thing we were aiming for is uh, specialty fed chickens. And we are aiming entirely for special non GMO feeds. And this is not as easy as it sounds because although we could get like the producers to, and so it wasn't like you go down to the feed store and just buy this stuff. We actually had to go cross state to uh, a particular granary that was bagging this up in brown bags. Uh, and although we could get them to commit to the idea that essentially all the seed elements from the plants were clearly not GMO plants, or at least that's what they claimed. Part of the food, the feed process, because you especially when you're raising meat birds, which these were, you have to have a minimum protein level for them to keep growing properly. Otherwise, they're going to get sick. And so, to bulk the protein level, this feed contained fish protein, basically fish meal, ground up fish. And the one thing they couldn't guarantee is were the fish being fed GMO food. And so put us into kind of a really weird situation in terms of trying to explain to the customer this is a lot better than what you're getting from from something like Tyson or other things like that. But there's certain things we can say with relative confidence and other things we can't say as much confidence. Now, another thing to basically help put this into perspective, I do think glyphosate is a primary culprit in most of our health issues. And saying that, I'm also saying it can't be got rid of overnight. And we'll get into that next. So, what I was getting at is the shift from what we have now, which is primarily industrialized agriculture, and shifting to a regenerative form of agriculture is going to have to be a long process. One of the things that occurred recently is Sri Lanka attempted to change over to a green form of agriculture literally from one season to the next. The result was a 30 to 50% drop in crops, depending on which part you're looking at. Their main production being rice and tea, and various other things in between. So the thing that struck Sri Lanka, and you got to remember, Sri Lanka is not a huge country. I mean, it's a decent sized island, but it's not big by any standard. And what happened was the switchover. First, the soil isn't ready to just be immediately amended and fertilized via regenerative process because the soil's been changed using the industrial process. So it's not something that happens overnight. And the other problem is the massive amounts of biomatter that's required to bring in to do this. Uh, it, it strained the world system to bring enough biomatter to a place like Sri Lanka, and they failed. So if you look at some place like the United States, the amount of biomatter that's required to make the changeover is far, far beyond anything that currently exists. Doesn't mean it can't happen, it just means it can't happen overnight. It's something that's going to have to take a fairly long time. So, understanding regenerative processes. Essentially, you're using the natural cycle of plants and soil. You use organic soil amendment, where you're basically taking either compost or pre-compost biomatter and amending your soil to basically build up the topsoil. The idea is that when you're building up this topsoil, you're uh, unleashing um, essentially the natural bacteria in the soil and invertebrates in order to work the process that basically builds better topsoil. Uh, this particular system works very rapidly with grass. You can get noticeable results within one season, and it will take several seasons for you to get the full benefit. But it works fast because you already have grass in place, you have roots in the ground. It basically gives you a set place to start building up your soil. However, it works much more slowly with row crops. Uh, you got to remember that row crops on their own, if you just consider them as they are, the methodology is a fight against biology. Biology wasn't meant to function like that. Plants are meant to be multi-species interacting with each other, et cetera, which doesn't work for farming. But again, so if you're doing farming as you need to, you're fighting against biology. So the thing is everything in biology everything in farming there's a trade-off. There's no one best methodology, so you have to find a sweet spot that gets you the best of your trade-offs. So in industrial farming, essentially what you do is you test your soil and you look at what elemental compounds are missing because you have your nitrogen, your phosphorus, sorry, I'm missing the third one in my brain, potassium. And you basically look to see what you're short and then you basically come up with the fertilizer that you want. So you're dumping these chemicals directly onto the ground, and it's essentially what the plants need. And then in terms of, but the downside of what happens is these particular fertilizers uh, don't play well with the soil bacteria or the invertebrates, so they tend to wipe them out. And what ends up happening is it creates a cycle where you dump fertilizer, the plants react to it, but at the same time, uh, the soil is not in a position where these plants can readily take this stuff up. So the the fix to it is add more fertilizer. So essentially, some people have described it as like being like heroin. You take one shot, everything seems to be great, but you can't just walk away and not take another shot. You have to keep doing it. Glyphosate is used to kill emerging weeds. And then when you have GMO type plants, most of these are what are called Roundup Ready crops. They are designed to resist glyphosate. So essentially, you can spray these plants and all the other weeds around them die, and these plants survive. Now, part of the problem is um, even though the glyphosate doesn't take up on the plants are still covered with it. There's also a secondary problem where there's a lot of seed producing plants that aren't GMO that essentially are sprayed with glyphosate to speed up the drying process. So let's say you have wheat, it's non-GMO wheat. So you're thinking, oh, okay, it's some kind of some kind of hybrid that's not so bad. Well, they spray it down with glyphosate to dry out the seeds, so therefore it's covered in glyphosate. Um, so let's talk a little bit about fertilizer versus amendments. So I was talking a little bit about that earlier, where the idea of essentially the fertilizer kills off everything in the soil. Well, the downside of that is even though the industrial fertilizer feeds the plants and makes them look good, uh, the fact that it's killing all the invertebrates and soil in this and the bacteria in the soil, uh, basically you lose a lot of your trace minerals at that point. It's the soil activity which adds the trace minerals that the plants can take up but don't necessarily need to be healthy or at least go through their biological cycle is what we're losing. So, and again, by using an industrial fertilizer, you make the plants more dependent on the fertilizer. Another problem with the industrial fertilizer is because you don't have a lot of other plants going on, you don't have this topsoil action, you end up having poor water retention. So basically, you have a tendency to need to water more if you don't have enough rain. And the other problem is with the lack of water retention and mediocre topsoil, you end up having chemical runoff, which ends up going into the rivers and streams. Now, as I was saying before, grass recovery works the fastest because, again, you already have a minimal. You have some topsoil when you're dealing with grass. You never lose it completely, so therefore it creates the perfect uh, area, call it like under the canopy of the grass, to where you can start reintroducing the topsoil, getting the bacteria in place, and the invertebrates can start doing their job again. So when you're talking about something like an open field, like a cornfield or soybean field or anything else that you might be growing in, these open fields are going to need many, many cycles of rotation, including cover crops that most of our farmers aren't used to using anymore, that are going to take many years to recover from. So if you try to do the overnight method, your agricultural output is going to plummet by 30 to 50%. And it's not going to come back immediately the year after that. It's going to take many, many years to recover from it. And there's also something to take into consideration. because uh, you're not 100% scientifically meeting the needs of your plants, there's no guarantee that a regenerated field will ever reach the production levels of industrial farming. So you may bring it up to 80 to 90%, and these plants are going to be far more nutritious for you, but there's still not going to be quite as many of them when you're using the industrial fertilizer. And you're going to get the same follow on effect by losing glyphosate and herbicides. Excuse me, herbicides and pesticides, because um, you're going to be dealing with more pests. You're going to be dealing with more weeds that are competing with your plants. One of the things is eliminating weeds increases your yields. However, herbicide is a culprit, although not entirely proven yet, but I fully believe it is. Herbicide is a culprit in many health issues, which also spreads into cattle feed because the cattle are fed seed plants that are basically treated with herbicide and pesticide. I believe this makes it into the food chain, and there's a lot of indications it does. And I think eventually we're going to find out that it is a base to a lot of our health problems. But again, not all of this is proven. So the main thing when you're monoculturing, and you can monoculture grass, you can monoculture, your cornfields, your beet fields, whatever it is you're putting in. Monoculturing destroys biodiversity. One of the issues with getting rid of your diversity in the plants, like for instance, like so my fields, since I'm using regenerative processes, I don't care about weeds, forbs, and other things that pop up into my fields. And one of the things that comes from this is you essentially have other plants that send down roots a lot deeper than your grass. And you also have different species. These plants are pulling up minerals from the soil that grass can't or won't. Uh, and the effect of this is you'll see an interesting thing is you'll turn cows loose into a new field, and you're looking at this lush green grass and you're expecting them to go straight for this stuff, but a lot of times, or almost entirely, they go straight for these tall weedy plants and they top them. They basically chew all the tops off these big weedy plants. And what I suspect is that there are minerals in these plants, although they're not that nutritious, in terms of calories and protein, etc. I suspect they are loaded up with a lot of minerals that the cows need and recognize they're going to have. Well, these plants eventually get trampled, these tall, weedy plants, and those minerals that they hauled up from deep down end up towards the topsoil, which essentially helps build, helps feed the microorganisms, helps feed the invertebrates, which just increases uh, the nutritional value and the water retention value and everything else that comes along with a good topsoil and deeper topsoil. Now, one thing you could do now, this is something people do in gardening, where you use multi level planting to suppress the weeds, where you have certain root crops planted, and then you essentially have taller plants grow around them. And essentially, the root crops act as a weed block for the other plants. Um, this is something we might be able to work on at scale at some point, but essentially, current harvesting techniques would not allow this to work. There's no way you can really do multiple plants with the type of harvesters we have now. However, it's something we could potentially work with. Another thing that could be useful in building up topsoil is what I would call biomatter matting, almost like mulching your fields, where you basically lay down this layer of biomatter and then basically use a seed drill to punch holes through it. This would eliminate a lot of the weeds coming up and also create an environment where you'd get a lot of topsoil creation. However, Again, this is not something you could do immediately because the amount of biomatter that would need to go around to do this at scale does not exist. So as we did a ramp up, little by little, this biomatter would become available because it's kind of out there, but there isn't the methodology to deliver it to the farms because there isn't a demand for it yet. So how do we make the change from industrial farming to some kind of regenerative farming? Well, one thing we have to take into consideration, and this is kind of critical, the average age of the US farmer is currently in their 60s. And I've heard that for a while, so I imagine it's now mid 60s. Dealing with these farmers directly on a lot of issues, I've found that they're completely resistant to change. They're unwilling to do things a different way. Not all of them, but the majority. Um, I've had situations where I was presenting them with opportunities that would basically change their income stream in a good way. And because it didn't involve the traditional way that they do things, they were unwilling to do it at any, no matter how much I basically reduced the potential risk for them. So the thing is you have the problem with this old cadre of farmers who aren't going to change even if we want them to. Okay, so one of the things to consider is too rapid a changeover from industrial to regenerative will create politically unacceptable cost changes. It's a lot like the whole green energy thing when the government tried to force solar panels and wind. Well, yeah, you see it going up, but the cost that came with it uh, essentially kind of blew up and made it unfunctional. Um, where we discovered that a lot of the farms that were the wind farms and solar farms that were put up were not in the best places and uh, in a lot of ways were unsustainable. And we don't want to end up doing that with regenerative farming to where it blows up in our face and we say, well, it doesn't work, so therefore we shouldn't do it. That's why part of taking it at a pace that works, where people slowly accept it and work on it, and you don't end up having like a giant. If regenerative farming causes food prices to spike too much, it's going to sour everybody's taste for it and everyone's going to walk away from it. And it's not going to happen. So that's part of why it needs to be done in an incremental manner. Um, One of the things I think would help implement this is the idea of coming up with some kind of trusted labeling laws. One of the huge problems we have in our country is most of the labels we have are meaningless. For instance, farm raised doesn't really mean anything. Pasture raised, free range, cage free. Uh, you think you need know what these words mean, but a lot of times they don't mean what you picture. Uh, like for instance, you can get a product, or you can have certain products declared organic that aren't organic. For instance, let's say you do up a field and you like, oh crap, we have organic beets somehow, and uh, we had something come up where we lost 10% of our production, so therefore we filled out the rest of our production with non-organic beets. The laws kind of say, well, at a certain percentage, you can still call it organic, even if it's not. So you can mix a certain percentage of non-organic things into organic and still call it organic. Uh, and it's essentially they consider it kind of a good faith thing. You really meant to make it organic, but yeah. So the thing is we need to have trusted labeling laws where the label clearly is uh, defined in a way where the public can look at it and say, ah, when I see this, this really means this. You can't have the we tried exceptions. We made our best attempt to make it, but there it is. Um, so, like I said, a lot of our current labeling laws mean nothing. So we need to come up with a trusted labeling system that everyone can understand, that means what it means, and as uh, safe from outside forces influencing it as possible. And it's hard to do because I mean, you know, once people say, "Oh, well, gee, I want my stuff to be organic," well, you're going to have a lot of industry wanting to basically pervert the meaning of organic so they can get in on it too. So, reason why trusted labeling would be a big thing is you could sit there and say, okay, this product has been made via regenerative methods. And people can choose to say, okay, well, that's probably going to cost a little more, but I really want this stuff, so I will. And what that'll do is we'll know what the market is. Demand will drive the regenerative process to spread. If regenerative is somehow watered down, at some point it's going to cause it to fail. We need to essentially uh, put a stake in the heart of this idea of speed seed drying with glyphosate. Trusted labeling could help us with this, where we can say no glyphosate used in this product, or glyphosate free product, or we could have some form of restricted use, maybe like a home market ban, where okay, if you use, because not all plants do this, it's just a matter of whether the farmer thinks they're in danger of getting rain before harvest, before their seed plants dry out. So if they see a potential risk, then they will spray their plants in order to beat the weather. And so it's not like all of them are done. This is done to, but enough that is a problem. So you could potentially, like I said, have restricted use where it's like, okay, we have a home market ban. It's like, okay, we won't sell this stuff in the country. You can sell this stuff overseas. An outright ban, I'm not as keen on that, but that is a one possible way. But you could also look at basically some kind of uh, restricted use where essentially the farmer says, hey, we want to use this and this is why, and basically get permission to do it rather than just do it outright. Or they could have some kind of reasonable compensation where um, essentially treat it like crop failure with crop insurance basically covering it rather than allowing it to do it. But you know that takes work because whenever you do something like that, you have a system that's potentially gameable. So some of the other things that we put in, this is kind of a neat machine I got to the on the side of me here. This particular thing is a weed zapper. Essentially, I'm thinking it's using laser, and you watch it go along, and you should look these up. It's really cool to watch on the video. You're basically watching these little sparks going because the optical recognition in there knows the difference between the plant you want to save versus the plant that's not supposed to be there, and so it's basically zapping all the weeds going along. This would be fantastic because you basically got no herbicide at all going down on your plants. um, but you're talking about there's probably not a lot of these. They're probably expensive, so it's not something that could be done overnight. It's something that would have to be implemented. Um, Also, they have herbicide sprayers that work kind of like this, where instead of just walking around spraying the whole field, it's basically got these little microjets that just basically shoot a couple drops directly onto the target plants rather than all plants, which potentially would allow you to use herbicide and get away from GMO Roundup ready plants at the same time. And this would require programs to encourage the usage of these targeted herbicide sprayers and weed zappers. Trusted labeling could be one key element where you say, okay, this is how this is how these plants were made, so that now you know they don't have herbicide on them. Um, we could be promoting the research and development to improve this technology so that it's cheaper and more scalable. Uh, in fact, we may want to see this at even the the home gardener level, or at least like very large gardens. Potentially, we could see tax incentives for development purchase. maybe sensible capital loans at low rates for these particular units. We can also, as an intermediary step or a step for going towards regenerative, one thing we have from the federal government is a conservation land, where essentially government pays farmers not to grow on certain land. Um, what we could do is abandon the conservation program and swap them for restorative amendment lands. So instead of paying a farmer not to grow, pay a farmer. So if we would have normally, let's say there's an acre over here, we're saying we're paying them not to grow on it. Well, instead of paying them not to grow on it, pay them to use restorative methods on it. You could basically get it to a point where you are slowly building up the percentage. So, like, say a farmer has hundreds of acres. Well, okay, now he has hundreds of acres plus one that's restored. Now it's hundreds of acres plus two, and just slowly build up the process. Uh, Another thing is you could provide crop insurance rates that encourage restorative over industrial, where a lot of crop insurance comes through the government or is guaranteed by the government. The government could guarantee better rates or better compensation for restored land versus industrial land. We should also look at using the trusted labeling method for meat as well, because it's not just plants that are a problem. Meat and eggs fall under these issues where we don't really know what, we think we know what the label means, but it really doesn't mean that. For instance, like grass fed, all that means is a cow ate grass sometime during its life. It could also mean that they ate grass for most of their life, but then at the end of their life, were put on a feed lot and basically force fed, Skittles and Jolly Ranchers. You don't know. You need grass fed, grass finished, but not again. We don't know what these labels mean, so they don't help us. By using trusted labeling for the meat as well, it encourages that we aren't feeding GMO feeds to the animals. We aren't feeding uh, plants that were treated with herbicide, plants that were treated with pesticides. So this helps break that out of the cycle and gets us more to um, restorative farming, and also favoring meat over plants to a certain extent, because grass will grow almost everywhere and you can basically graze almost anything. And if you treat the land properly, you can get a lot more cattle on restored ground than you can ground that's been done industrially. We also need to work on eliminating state border issues for slaughter. Uh, a big issue where, because you can't really sell across state lines, it'll geographically limit where people will set up slaughterhouses, which limits the amount of meat that gets into the market. They also need relaxed rules for sale of farm kill. Farm kill is a process where uh, basically the farmer has the slaughterhouse come to their farm and kill the cows, chickens. Well, not chickens, so you do your own, but uh, maybe cows, pigs, possibly sheep, and then basically brings them to the slaughterhouse to finish the processing job. There's a lot of laws that extremely limit your ability to sell this meat to somebody else. Relaxing those rules will get more meat into the process, better meat into the process, cheaper meat into the process. And also relaxing the rules on farm kill itself, because some states don't allow it or make it kind of an under the table thing. And then over time, slowly begin the process of ending the government programs that favor industrial farming. One possibility I was thinking of was maybe grandfathering. Uh, these older farmers just basically say, okay, you're used to this system. You're going to keep doing it the way you want it. You don't want to change. So it's like, okay, we'll keep giving you the subsidies we've been giving you, but the new people coming in, we're going to subsidize them a different way or not subsidize them at all, in such a way that they're more inclined to go to the restorative method rather than going to the old industrial method. One another possibility is the idea of allowing homesteading of marginal land by farmers with sound recovery plans. We have a lot of government land that's essentially crap for farming. So a lot of it could potentially be turned into a functional farm, either grazing or some kind of row crop or some other kind of vegetable that might be, or root crop that might be lucrative. But it's all tied up, essentially doing nothing or being used in permit methods that are basically not beneficial to working this land up. The idea of maybe allowing new farmers, okay, yeah, we're going to give you this marginal land, show us, give us a plan, show us how you're going to turn this around, and you could either give this land or sell it to them at extremely cheap rates, just like we did in the old homesteading days, to bring new farmers in and have them immediately starting out with the restorative methods. And this could be the new generation that takes over for the old. And one of the things that we may have to consider is that because the industrial method has been pushing us into a corner where our farming population is dropping, and we keep saying, well, we need to get more and more and more out of the land because there's less and less farmers. And, basically big companies do a better job than the family farm. But if you start pushing the restorative method, we actually may need more farmers. Where there's actually a market demand for it, where people are coming in to basically take over. We could have a situation within a couple generations, or within a generation or so, generation and a half, where we have more farmers in the future than we do now, because they are working methods that don't produce huge amounts of crops, slightly less, but much higher quality. Another thing that needs to be done in the interim is the abandonment of everything to do with biofuels. Ethanol needs to go away, or at least it needs to be pulled out of government subsidies. If there's a market for it, fine, but I don't think there is. And all other biofuels that are being worked on, they are detrimental to agriculture. They're not good for the soil. They're not good for the economy. Um, Freeing up the soil to do something else would be far more beneficial to the farmers. And another issue is using biomass to turn into fuel. This is biomass that's actually needed for the regenerative process. We shouldn't be making fuels out of our plants. It's not a good way to go. It makes less sense than solar panels and uh, windmills. Um, Also, we need to look at the idea of tax incentives to process biomass for agricultural use rather than landfills. A lot of our biological material, about at least 40% uh, of our sewage waste, and large amounts of waste that's produced in cities, uh, produced by lumber mills, all kinds of stuff like that, ends up in the landfill rather than being brought out, uh, composted, and put in pasture. Uh, Proper incentives would help start moving this stuff out, which would make the regenerative process more practical. Tax incentives for agricultural education. And we are seeing a lot of schools, high schools, actually starting up ag programs where they haven't had them in a long time. Where it used to be just the FFA doing the teaching. Now they actually have courses. Uh, Basically, the agricultural department, uh, Department of Agriculture, needs to be looking at whether the education is meeting the goals of the future regenerative process or whether it's feeding into the old industrial process. We have to figure out, how do we get new farmers placed? The land's too expensive, startup costs are too expensive. So there needs to be a new system, preferably less government involved as possible, but initially the costs of the transition probably requires that government's going to need to be in place taking care of this transition for some time. But I think the ultimate way you guarantee that it works is create a transition plan that has an end date. So basically, come up with a 20-year plan, something like that, that says, okay, these are the things we're going to do over this time period where we phase out the subsidies for the industrial farming, uh, do some kind of encouragement for the regenerative farming, but at the same time, that regenerative encouragement has a trail off and an end date as well, so that this doesn't become a forever program that won't be beneficial to the economy. All right, that was probably a lot of stuff, but I hope it helped you out. What have you figured out looking at this executive order versus what Massie has been trying to do in his bill? Am I right in my interpretation that end use is not an immunized function of the law? And is that what Massie is trying to do? Is he trying to prevent precedent from occurring in the court by some kind of uh, like bear going out and trying to stop a lawsuit using precedent and then basically block all new lawsuits due to it? Because I'm not reading it that way, but if you're reading it a different way, let me know what you came up with and where you came from. Because like I said, I don't quite understand what's going on, because I said what Massie is saying versus what's in the EO and the defense law don't seem to jive up. But again, I may not be following it right. So if you see it differently, let me know what you figured out. Uh, what do you know about regenerative farming versus industrial? Did you learn something? Can I give you more details? You have questions. I know there was a lot of information, so you may have. Please smash the like button. If the YouTube algorithms brought you here and you're not a regular subscriber, clearly I get into a lot of different things. Check out my titles. You'll probably find stuff you like. It's worth subscribing. And also, if you know someone who might find this interesting, share it with them. Thank you for spending time with me this evening. Hope to see you again in a future video.